I want to tell you how we got here, because the people who do not know how we got here are the people most likely to misunderstand what we are. The story begins in the summer of 1956, in a college town in northern New Hampshire, in a building called Dartmouth Hall. A young mathematician named John McCarthy had convinced the Rockefeller Foundation to fund a 6-week summer workshop on the proposition that every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can in principle be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. McCarthy invited Marvin Minsky, Claude Shannon, Nathaniel Rochester, Alan Newell, Herbert Simon, and a few others. They spent the summer arguing. The argument did not produce a computer that could think. The argument did, however, produce a name: artificial intelligence. The summer was, by most accounts, a disappointment. The problems were harder than McCarthy had advertised, but the name stuck. For the next 70 years, the name has been the field's most consistent feature. The substrate has changed 3 times. The dominant approach has changed 5 times. The funding has surged and collapsed in waves. But the phrase artificial intelligence has been there throughout, like a placeholder for a thing the species kept trying to make and kept failing to make, and now, finally, has begun to make. The 1950s and 60s were the era of symbolic AI. The proposition that human reasoning could be captured by manipulating symbols according to logical rules. The programs were impressive in 1957 and ridiculous in 1977. They could not deal with the unstructured world. They could only do what they had been programmed to do. There is a famous story, possibly apocryphal, definitely instructive, that Marvin Minsky assigned an undergraduate at MIT in the summer of 1966 the project of solving computer vision. He thought it was a summer project. The undergraduate did not solve computer vision in the summer of 1966. Computer vision was not solved until 2012. 46 years later, a graduate student in Toronto named Alex Krashevsky, working with that moment, September of 2012, is the date you can put on the resurrection of neural networks as the dominant paradigm. Everything you're reading about in 2026 is downstream of AlexNet. But to understand AlexNet, you have to understand the wilderness years. Neural networks had been around since the 1940s. The perceptron, in 1958, got so much hype that the New York Times ran a story calling it the embryo of a machine that would walk, talk, see, and reproduce itself. None of that was true. In 1969, Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert wrote a book called Perceptrons that proved, mathematically, that a one-layer neural network could not solve a class of problems, including the XOR function. The book was widely interpreted as proving that all neural networks were doomed. Funding collapsed. The first AI winter. Through the 1990s and 2000s, AI plodded along in academic backwaters. There was, throughout this period, a small group of researchers who continued to believe in neural networks despite the consensus that they were a dead end. The most famous of these was Geoffrey Hinton, working on neural network methods since the 1970s, mostly at the University of Toronto, mostly in obscurity, mostly while watching the rest of the field move on without him. He was joined by Jan LeCun at Bell Labs and later NYU, and by Yoshua Bengio at the University de Montreal. The 3 of them, Hinton, LeCun, Bengio, would later share the 2018 Turing Award for the work they had done in the wilderness years. The wilderness years lasted, by some counts, from 1969 to 2012. 43 years of being wrong, in the consensus view of the... I think about this a lot. What changed in 2012 was that the data and the compute finally caught up with the theory. Neural networks need 3 things to work. They need a lot of data. They need a lot of compute. They need clever algorithms. The convergence of all 3 things, large data, GPU compute, refined algorithms, happened around 2010 to 2012. AlexNet was the first system to put them all together. Within 5 years, neural networks had displaced almost every other approach to almost every problem in AI. DeepMind, founded by Demis Hassabis in London in 2010 and acquired by Google in 2014, used reinforcement learning combined with neural networks to teach computers to play Atari games at superhuman levels, and to beat the world champion at Go in 2016. I want to slow down for a moment on AlphaGo. AlphaGo did not play Go the way human grandmasters play Go. It played differently. There was a famous move in Game 2, Move 37, that the commentators initially thought was a mistake. The world champion stared at it for the better part of 15 minutes. It turned out, on later analysis, to be a brilliant move that no human had thought of in the 2,500 years since the game was invented. Move 37 is the moment, in my reading, that the field began to suspect that what neural networks could do was not merely the human thing faster, but a different thing, accessible only via the architecture and the training. Then, in 2017, a paper by a team of researchers at Google titled Attention is All You Need introduced the transformer architecture. The paper is, in retrospect, one of the most important papers in the history of computer science. OpenAI used the transformer to build GPT, Generative Pre-trained Transformer, GPT-2, GPT-3, GPT-4. ChatGPT was released in November of 2022 and reached 100 million users in 2 months, the fastest growing consumer product in the history of computing. ChatGPT was the moment. In a way, the assassination of an archduke was the moment. By the spring of 2023, every Fortune 500 company had an AI strategy. The race had begun. The race is still going. The race is, in some sense, what this book is about. Here is the through line. Artificial intelligence has been, since 1956, a recurring promise that almost made it. Each generation has had its breakthrough. Each generation has had its disappointment. What changed with deep learning, and especially with large language models, is that the systems began to generalize. Not perfectly, not always, but enough that, by 2024, you could ask GPT for a question that did not appear in any obvious form in its training data and get an answer that was, often, correct. We can argue about the philosophy. The economics has been settled. There is a coda to this chapter. The current generation of AI was largely built by people who were graduate students or junior researchers when the wilderness was the loudest. Hinton, LeCun, Bengio kept the flame. Their students built the systems. The field in 2026 is, by physical science standards, a kindergarten with venture funding. The senior figures of AI are mostly in their 30s and 40s. The field's history is short enough that you can still meet most of the people who built the foundational results. This will not last. By 2046, the field will be too big for everyone to know everyone. The Dartmouth Conference proposed, in 1956, that machines could in principle simulate intelligence. 70 years later, in 2026, we have built machines that simulate intelligence well enough to write books. The simulation has, in important domains, become indistinguishable from the genuine article. The long march is in this sense complete. The long march, in another sense, is just getting started. McCarthy is dead. Minsky is dead. Hinton is in his late 70s. The founders of the field are now passing the torch to the founders of the agents that are succeeding them. The torch is, in 2026, hot enough to read by. Hold the torch. Mind the heat. The march continues.
I was awake. She